Thursday, January 23rd. I'm Adam Walsh, and this is The Signal. Today on the show, Donald Trump is once again president of the United States, and today we are talking about a Trump reality for Canada, what that may mean for the country. We're talking worries, realities, and trying to plan our way out of uncertainty.
In terms of 25% on Mexico and Canada because they're allowing vast numbers of people. Canada's a very bad abuser also. Vast numbers of people to come in and fentanyl to come in.
When do you think we would enact those?
I think February 1st.
Are you planning on keeping notes of that?
I think we'll do it February 1st.
25% on both, sir?
Sir, on each.
So that was U.S. President Donald Trump after his inauguration on Monday, in attendance at the inauguration down in D.C. Premier Andrew Furey was there. So yesterday he spoke with St. John's Morning Show host Jen White about the trip and threats to tariffs. Have a listen to just a little bit of what Premier Furey had to say.
The only thing that's certain is uncertainty when it comes to the President of the United States. I do think that we need to be prepared to exercise our strength in a proportional way, in a responsible way. But as I've said from the very beginning, one that doesn't pit region against region, one that is, and one that doesn't pit industry against industry, because you can see a world in which we, protect our oil and gas product and to the detriment of our fishery, for example, or the auto manufacturing industry in Ontario. But the last thing I want to see in Newfoundland and Labrador is oil workers fighting with crab fishermen. That doesn't make any sense. We need a united front. But the national government has to use in its toolbox things that we don't have as a subnational government, monetary policies, the full extent of the Treasury to support workers in the industry and that way in industries. And that way one industry isn't pitted against each other, region against region. And we can have a strong and united Canada. From day one, I've felt that this is an attack on our identity. It's an attack on our unity, and if we let fractures continue within the country, then not only will the president lever those fractures and extract more value from Canada, we have the danger of running the risk of being a very different place when this is all said and done, and I don't think anyone wants that.
Premier Andrew Furey yesterday on the St. John's Morning Show, speaking with host Jen White. So here we are. A question for you folks. What are your thoughts about the tariff threats and what we should or should not do? The text line is open, 709-327-8206. Email us thesignal@cbc.ca. A little later in the show, we will hear from economist Jim Stanford, who wrote a piece called Who's Subsidizing Whom? Myth and Reality about the Canada-U.S. trade balance. Spoiler, Mr. Stanford used the words utterly false when talking about what some of Donald Trump has been saying. But to the folks I have here with me in studio, full house here today again. Jessica McCormick, president of the Newfoundland and Labrador Federation of Labour. Dawn Street, president of the FFAW. Emery Boudreau as chief executive officer of the Board of Trade. And Tom Cooper at Mum Business Prof. Thanks all for coming in. Out of the gate, Trump 2.0, right? Jessica, we'll start with you. Past couple of weeks, what's that been like in your position? And I'll see for everyone else, because I can't imagine for in your types of positions the thought process and all the people you must be talking to.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to speak for the other panelists. I'm sure they'll share their own thoughts, but this has been kind of the number one issue that we've been thinking about and talking about at the Federation of Labour. We represent 70,000 unionized workers across the province in industries that will be very much impacted by a 25% tariff. So we've been talking to our members, to heads of unions in Newfoundland and Labrador about this, but we've also been connecting with national unions, labor economists to talk about what's happening in other parts of the country and how we can kind of all pull together and share information and have that united approach that Premier Furey has been talking about.
How would you describe the size of the effort here?
I think that it's comparable to the effort and the discussions that we had around the pandemic and how we responded to that crisis. I mean, this tariff threat is very real. Donald Trump is a very unpredictable character in politics, that's for sure. But we have to prepare as if he is, absolutely going to implement these tariffs on February 1st.
Dawn, what about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. It's definitely a massive cloud of uncertainty for us. Of course, the last few years we've seen a lot of instability with the snow crab industry, of course, and that's our bread and butter in the fishing industry. 90% of our snow crab goes into the United States, and if we're facing down 25% tariffs, that's a massive, massive issue with our members on what that's going to mean to price negotiations, which started yesterday, what that's going to mean to their bottom line. And after coming out of the pandemic, after seeing historic highs in snow crab prices, the last couple of years have been a struggle. And I'm sure your listeners are well aware, it's just been absolute chaos. Folks haven't been able to operate under the low prices of the past couple of years. There have been labor disruptions, protests, and we were really, really looking forward to a year with some stability. The market seems to be rebounding, and everything was looking positive. So all of a sudden, then we get the 25% bomb dropped on us, and what that's going to look like, we just don't know.
Yeah, because I found a lot of times it's like crab, they'll say boom years, and then you get ready for like the lean or some of the bust years, but then this wrench gets thrown in, right? So you're like, okay, we've had a couple, but now we're hopeful, and then the unknown of a new president in the United States who's tossing out tariffs, right? When you talk to your members, what types of things are they saying to you, like individually around this and the approach?
It's just worry.
Yeah.
Because the last couple of years we've been working with the Association of Seafood Producers to try and come up with some market-based formula on snow crab that will help us avoid a lot of the turmoil that we see in the spring every single year. And last year we got to a point where we had something we could work with, and talks were going very positively. We've pulled our committee together now and just looking at moving forward with the formula-based fishery. We think we can get there. But how do you factor in the threat of a 25% tariff into that process? And, obviously, what is that going to do to consumer buying power in the United States? When it comes to retaliatory tariffs, if that's the case, how is that money used? Do we lobby government to focus on the fishery, considering that would be one of the industries that's most affected? So, it's all these questions that are hanging over our heads, and our members right now are coming to us looking for answers, and at the moment, I don't think we really have them.
Right. Anne-Marie, what about yourself?
I think a lot of what my colleagues here have said in terms of, this is chaotic and people are kind of left questioning right now what's going to happen. And I think there's no worse position you can be in as a business owner when you can't make predictable plans and when you can't, kind of chart your own course and know what's going to happen. So right now we find ourselves in a scenario where we're having these conversations. I think it's really helpful that we've been a part of, the Premier has a round table pulled together. All of us are at that table, which is really helpful. And it's a really good way to stay informed, which is useful. There's a Canadian chamber that we're a part of national conversations, which is also really helpful and a really good way to stay informed. But I think the reality is we have members right now who are saying, how do we plan for the future? Yeah. And that's a really scary position to be in.
Instability and unknowns for folks trying to plan business stuff. Not a great position. Give folks an idea. When we say Board of Trade, right? Give folks an idea of the range, because it's like you're on yesterday, and I said 800 members, I think. But what's the range for the Board of Trade for membership?
Yeah, so our members are throughout the province. Yeah. We cover all areas of the province and every sector. Every industry,
okay, everything.
You name it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, which is really helpful and really good to be unified in that way. But it also means that we're representing a plethora of issues that we're facing. And so while I'd like to think tariffs is the biggest thing we're facing right now, this is one more thing on a list of consequences that are being thrown at and challenges that are being thrown at businesses right now.
Yeah, because I mentioned you're on yesterday. Yesterday, the show was about immigration. And today it's about potential for tariffs, but all of which is making it harder for folks to do business and grow the economy and their businesses and families in this province.
It is one challenge after another.
Right. Tom, for yourself as a business prof, what are you paying attention to and what have the conversations been like through this?
Once again, as Anne-Marie said, just echoing what everybody else was talking about. But when I look at this, Trump positions himself as the great disruptor. He positions himself to as people talk about him being a great business person. I always see him as a reality TV star first, and this is great theater, and this is great TV ratings.
Even the inauguration was like, I was listening to a podcast yesterday of like the outdoors, the indoors. Yes, there's a temperature discussion, but that the visuals of the tech folks and everything else, the comment was theater.
Very much so. And the tech folks, the oligarchs, as Biden described them, really kind of points back to an earlier age, which Trump referred to a number of times in his inauguration speech, which is McKinley. And that's over 100 years now. And McKinley was one of the first big users of tariffs. So we think about over 100 years ago, and they're going back to Trump wants to go back to a policy approach that's basically outdated. I was trying to put it in food terms, trying to describe to a 16-year-old what that means. And I said, it's kind of like back, my grandparents used to like tripe. Nobody eats tripe anymore.
Very few.
Very few. There's connoisseurs around tripe.
My dog eats tripe.
Your dog eats tripe. But that was something, back in the 1912s, 1914, coming out from there as well. So I would describe, and I've heard not only, the private sector and the unionized workforce, but also the not-for-profit sector and the and parts of government, et cetera, just talking about this creates huge amounts of risk and uncertainty. And there's a really good acronym that I use when I'm teaching risk management, which is, and it's going to sound rude, but it's called VUCA, which is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And that's not good for labor. That's not good for business. That's not good for government. That's not good for anybody, because you want to be able to plan. You want to be able to strategize. You want to be able to develop new markets. You want to be able to make sure that you can talk to your stakeholders and say, this is what we should be doing, this is what we shouldn't be doing. And Trump doesn't allow that. So for me, in terms of the major issues, is around supply chain. Tariffs are principally used to protect industries, but the ramifications are right down through the supply chain. And secondly, in terms of the decreased revenue that will come from taxation, as Dwan and Jessica and Anne-Marie were saying, people may buy less, right? And if they buy less, that means less taxation going into the government, which means less money that can be spent on social programs, and as all the complexities that we were talking about get exasperated. But moreover, for me, it's kind of the wider issue around what Trump has been talking about is about the manifest destiny, going back and saying they can cause a lot of trouble in the short and medium and long term to Canada if we don't take a comprehensive approach to dealing with these tariffs. So if we have Alberta fighting with Saskatchewan, which is fighting with Newfoundland and Labrador, to me, that opens itself up to saying the United States coming up and saying, okay, well, let's talk about maybe what should this look like in the future. So I'm a little bit concerned about the manifest destiny strategy that Trump referred to in his inauguration speech as well.
What do we think about how this is being handled politically so far? I started the show. We heard from the Premier, who was down at the inauguration. There's talks, the roundtable discussion, right, for bringing folks into the conversation. You've got Team Canada, maybe or maybe not, minus the Premier of Alberta, depending on how you splice that one. But what do we think about this so far?
From my perspective, there are lots of issues that we don't always all align on. We don't always agree on approaches, but I think we all do agree that the Premier has shown some real leadership in convening this task force. Personally, I think this is something that should be a long-term table that we're all a part of, that we all use to share information and share strategy and approach going beyond the tariffs. But I think that united Team Newfoundland and Labrador or Team Canada approach is the only way to deal with Trump. He is looking for that wedge to sweep in and divide us and pit province against province or industry against industry. That puts him in a stronger position as a negotiator. So I think Premier Fury's approach to it has been a good one and a collaborative one, which is I think where we all need to be.
Dawn?
I agree. Yeah, in the labor movement, we always say we're stronger together, and we've definitely seen that with the Premier's roundtable, so we thank him for that. Even how he's portrayed Newfoundland and Labrador's approach in the media, I think, has been very good. And from what we're hearing from our members, they appreciate it and they feel informed. And I think that's helping with some of the damage control with our membership right now, is they do feel they're in the know, the premier's on it and having everybody to the table. As Jessica said, we're not going to align on everything, but this one I think is something we can definitely all come together on.
Anyone else on the approach? Emery, any thoughts?
No, I would agree with my colleagues. And I think, the information sharing that's happening right now, the Premier is feeding information in from conversations, which is really useful because we can be sharing that with our members and they understand, where the conversation is. And I think at the end of the day, sometimes that's all people really need is just the willingness to be kind of kept informed so then they can make decisions, but also just a part of the conversation.
So, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I agree with locally, provincially. It's been awesome. It's been great. On a Canada-wide approach, though, I'm a bit concerned, especially Premier Smith in Alberta. She's still down in Washington since the inauguration, supposedly doing post-inauguration things. But, the oil and gas sector is incredibly important to Alberta, and it's incredibly important to the Americans because it's cheap, versus bringing him over from Saudi. And then even yesterday, the premier of Saskatchewan was coming out and saying, well, maybe we shouldn't be 100%. We'll maybe, take this approach, that approach. So when we start to see those fractures on a Team Canada approach, that's what worries me.
Yeah, because, and when we say Team Canada approach, we're at this point now. We're still talking about, okay, how do we do? What do we do? So if on February 1st, all of a sudden, what if it is tariffs on crab, or what if he does try to divide and conquer, or it's an oil and gas thing, or it's something else that is specific? How hard will it be to stay together on a Team Canada approach? And especially if we're saying there's layers of perhaps sending our own tariffs back, right? If we're going to respond in a Team Canada way, how hard will it be to stay together, depending on if it's your industries or folks that you're responsible for talking to, coming back to you being like, wait a minute, this is us, it's not them. Can we stay together around that?
I think it'll be difficult when you think about the reactions, because I think people will be making real-time decisions. They're going to be thinking about their individual borders, individual industries. I really appreciate the conversation that's happening right now from a proactive position, and hearing our leaders come together and talk about how do we trade more internally? What do we do to change the rules against, what we've always known? How do we increase internal trade amongst Canadians? So I think, if we can keep kind of some of those at the top and stay focused on what are some of the proactive things that we can do in reaction to this situation, I think that will help us kind of survive this better.
Yeah, being thoughtful in the beginning and talking about what could happen, planning even for some of the unknowns and being ready for it, puts us, you're saying, in a better position to react for when or if stuff happens.
And again, staying to the table together.
Yeah.
And the Premier's been doing a great job scheduling regular meetings because, we're not all off on our own doing our own thing. And that united approach and keeping us together, I think, is definitely going to help that unity as we go forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to pick up on what Anne-Marie was saying, I mean, this is a great opportunity for us to really look at our industrial policy provincially and nationally. It's a good opportunity for us to think about procurement policies and what steps we can be taking internally. If there are tariffs on February 1st, there will likely be retaliatory tariffs. There's lots of speculation on where that would start, whether it's Kentucky bourbon or Florida orange juice.
Yeah, or the New York Times piece, right?
Yeah. So there's lots of speculation around that. I think it's dangerous to focus solely on that retaliation and not think about the bigger policy picture, which is what Anne-Marie was speaking about there.
Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, and the repercussions, though, of tariffs can be quite substantial. If we look historically, sorry, I sound like a business school professor, but that's what I am. But if you look
That's why you're invited.
Yes, thanks. Historically, when those tariffs were introduced in kind of post-World War I, a lot of them were put in place, and they said that led to the Great Depression because the Americans were so insular and they had so many tariffs around uncompetitive industries. It just, once again, it caused one of the great economic failures of modern history, I would put it. So to me, that's one of the what are the not only the short term in terms of retaliatory, but what does that mean in the long term? And especially on a micro level, Emery, when I think of all the supply chains that even local companies are involved in down the United States, whether it's oil and gas or it's seafood or if it's in mining, et cetera, and all those small to medium-sized companies can be affected. And a lot of them are really tight margins these days because of inflation, labor costs, a whole bunch of other issues, as you alluded to, Emery. So that's one of the other, there's a whole bunch of downside risks that we have to think about as well.
I think, sorry if I can,
go for it.
Yeah, just an additional thought on that. I think one of the things as well that we need to be really mindful of with these relationships, with these supply chains, there is the monetary increase, which, has obviously the ability to be detrimental, but there are also longstanding partnerships and relationships between companies, between associations, between industries, and we can't, take that lightheartedly. There's a lot, and there are people behind all of these, well-established relationships, and that's concerning.
And a lot with the economy, I'm just thinking of like two octopus dancing together, all wound up. Because to Jesse, the piece you were just mentioning, right? The New York Times, Canada's plan for a trade war, pain for red states and Trump allies. Canadian officials are preparing retaliatory measures if the new U.S. administration poses tariffs on Canadian imports. So this was just from the other week, right, in the lead up to the inauguration, and to what both of you were just saying. One point that stood out to me as an example of just like how complex everything is. They're talking about the, here we go. A single vehicle, for example, crosses the U.S.-Canadian border up to 8 times before it is fully assembled. Tariffs would immediately disrupt auto assembly lines across the United States and in Ontario, the auto industry's heart in Canada. Now, that's just the auto industry, but just that example, like I didn't know that, 8 times back and forth before the car is made. Like, it is so complex, and the ripple effects, the repercussions, there's tons of stuff we don't know about either, right? Mm-hmm. I mentioned tape from Jim Stanford, and I spoke to him yesterday in Vancouver. So he's got that piece that he wrote, and it's Who's Subsidizing Whom? Myth and Reality about the Canada-U.S. trade imbalance. And so Jim Stanford, economist and director of the Centre for Future Work out of Vancouver. This is about 4 minutes of Jim Stanford just explaining the piece, and it'll just give a little bit of extra kind of layers to our conversation. So folks, take a listen.
Well, as an economist, I was just so annoyed at the basic lies that were coming from President Trump and his team about the Canada-U.S. trade relationship. Both the numbers were wrong. He just makes them up. That seems to be how he rolls, claiming that there's a $200 billion deficit with Canada, which is nonsense. But even worse, the theory behind it, his claim that a bilateral trade deficit means we're a basket case, we're a charity case, we're being subsidized by America, and that's absolutely wrong. That isn't how trade works. Yes, we sell them a bit more than they sell us. Now, that is on a giant two-way trade flow of $1 trillion a year, goods and services going both ways across the border. So it's the deficit, which is more like $40 billion, not $200 billion, is small in the scheme of that two-way trade. But this idea that constitutes a subsidy is absolutely wrong. In fact, there's several ways that they get a uniquely sweet deal out of their trade with us. If anything, I argue we're subsidizing them.
And what are some of the points of how we're subsidizing them?
Well, the overall trade flow is mutually beneficial. We each buy stuff from the other that we need, and that helps us be more efficient. So that's not a subsidy. That's just trade. But there's 3 ways I identified where the nature of the trade is unusual and sort of deviates from normal international trade practices. One of them, energy. It's not just that we sell them a whole lot of energy, 4 million barrels of oil a day and lots of other forms of energy as well. But the terms of the deal are unusual. It's discounted well below world prices. They're getting it on the cheap for various reasons, because of how the infrastructure has been built and the quality of the crude and the fact that, they're basically our only customer for exports for the most part. And then they also have unique access to invest and own the petroleum industry that is selling the oil to them. And that is very unusual. If you go around the world, you can't find any other net oil exporting countries where the whole industry is open to foreign investment like ours is. So the Americans have about $55 billion worth of foreign direct investment in our oil and gas sector. And that means they can make profits off of the fact that they're buying our oil on the cheap. Sometimes they refine it and sell it to other countries, believe it or not. So that is a sweet deal and quite a subsidy. That's the first one. A second one, Adam, is the services trade. Mr. Trump never talks about services. He's always talking about container ships and trucks and tangible merchandise. But services trade is a huge area of trade, and it's growing, and the Americans have a lock on it. They've got the biggest banks and the biggest consultants and the biggest digital streaming and data companies. That's where the action is these days. And because of the sort of ephemeral nature of the service, it's electrons crossing the border. Nobody can keep track of it. Nobody can record it. Nobody can regulate it. And nobody can tax it. And the fact that the big U.S. companies, Google and Meta and Amazon and Uber and so on, all sell tens of billions of dollars worth of services in Canada, but it doesn't show up in the trade balance, and it doesn't, for the most part, get taxed. That's a subsidy, and he always ignores services trade. The third one we found in the report is capital flows. The only way that America can keep running trade deficits, and they've had one for 49 straight years, safe bet it'll be 50 this year, is because the rest of the world supplies them capital. And that includes Canada. We lend them hundreds of billions of dollars, which in a way allows them to buy our stuff. The funny thing with Canada is we lend it on the cheap, just like we do with our energy. Mostly it's government bonds and other low-interest assets that we own in America. And even though they owe us on a net basis, we pay them net interest and profit and dividends on the investment account, $13 billion a year. Adam, it's like you went to the bank and got a mortgage, and then the bank paid you interest instead of the other way around. It's not supposed to happen that way.
So it was me talking with economist Jim Stanford yesterday. I'm Adam Walsh. You're listening to The Signal. We're talking about tariff threats out of the United States on the show today. And my question for you, what are your thoughts about the tariff threats and what we should or should not do? Text us 709-327-8206. Email us thesignal@cbc.ca. Here with me in the studio, we've got Tom Cooper, Munn Business Prof, Anne-Marie Boudreau, Chief Executive Officer for the Board of Trade, Dwan Street, President of the FFAW, Jessica McCormick, President of the Newfoundland and Labrador Federation of Labor. Thoughts on what Mr. Stanford was saying there, folks? Anything jump out at you?
Happy to chime in on that. I guess initially, it just makes you kind of pause and say, well, shouldn't we just not take at surface value what Trump has the ability to deliver? And I think, there is a lot of propaganda around President Trump. I think Tom alluded to, you see him as a reality star first and then a politician. And maybe that's half of his charisma and power that he has and why he has the power of conviction to get people to believe. Initially, when these, threats of tariffs were kind of posted on what we now call X, and the reaction of it, there were quite a few days, and I was kind of just combing some American Chamber of Commerce just to see what they were saying.
Right.
And believe it or not, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, smaller American chambers of commerce, they don't support this either because they did figure out that it was going to put prices up for Americans. But that's not widely understood, and there's not a lot of conversation. And if you do some media reading of U.S. publications, it's not easy to find anything that supports that notion.
Yeah, and then for the education side, it's like even to find stuff that supports it, and then people need to be connected with it, and depending on their media diet and where they're getting their media from.
Precisely.
In today's world. Yeah, go ahead. Go for it.
For me, the service element is really, really complex, both in terms of how we buy and how we export. Whether it's, the consultants that government loves to bring in from the United States to verify or give assurance around what they're trying to do, whether it's we taking some really smart people and sending them to the United States to work on projects, et cetera. One of the great Newfoundland and Labrador business success stories, Verifin, is now NASDAQ Verifin because it's owned by a U.S. company, right?
Yeah, so what happens there?
Yeah. So do that mean when Verifin sells one of its amazing products to a U.S. bank, do they have to charge 25% extra? I don't know. And this is where the complexity starts to come in because we're so integrated on a supply chain basis. It's not like we're selling into Nigeria or South Africa or Argentina, where it's more defined. We're selling into our biggest historical trading partner that's been there for hundreds of years. And it just doesn't make sense. I think it's, once again, it's this political theater that Trump is trying his external revenue service rather than the internal revenue service as a way to raise taxes, as a way to raise revenue to reduce taxes. And it sounds great, but in reality, it just doesn't make sense. And Mr. Sanford's section kind of once again alluded to me and really kind of brought home that point that this seems to be grand political theater rather than something that's going to actually make anybody better off.
And it's hard. And it's hard sometimes to look at for if you're looking for sense in it. This is a guy who President Trump will rail against fentanyl being brought in, talking about being brought into the United States, but at the same time give a pardon to the person who invented the dark web, which was all about drug smuggling. Right? You're like, I can't marry those two together because it is rather difficult. Jessica, you're going to say?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that it also, I think, supports the idea that it's not just about when and if tariffs will be implemented. It's the chill effect that it puts on investment and industry and business decision making right now before and we're operating in this ecosystem of misinformation and the very services that we buy, the platforms that you listed, Meta, Google, all of these folks who were lined up at the inauguration. I mean, that's where people are getting information on this. So, it's really feeding into how consumers make decisions, but also how businesses are investing, and then that impacts people working in those industries, whether it's in Canada and the U.S. or people buying things from grocery stores. So it's a real complex mess, I guess, just to use a real technical term there.
And we are in that era too, where the sensationalism, that's what sells, right? And I mean, that's Trump's whole thing. And social media, I think, is definitely our downfall in a lot of instances. But I mean, on the high level, I can see why people would latch on to, lower taxes. Look at these countries, the drugs, the illegal immigrants, and all those taglines. But when you start actually looking into the details, like Jim Stanford has, and I did read his article, and he says how Canada's the largest market in the world for U.S. exports, over $440 billion in 2023, and America exports 92 cents to us for every dollar they purchase. So, what is he trying to accomplish here?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just when you look down to the fine details, it just doesn't make sense, and it's clear what he's doing. But what's that going to do to harm the relationship between Canada and the U.S.? What's it going to do to harm his own people at the end of the day, right?
And I was going to ask you too, because we talked about crab. Are there other species that you're worried about for tariffs?
Yeah, for sure. Cod is one. We're at about 45% of our cod goes into the United States. Lobster, and the lobster industry right now in Newfoundland and Labrador is exploding. We have capacity issues here just because the resource has grown so much. So the American market is what we rely on for lobster as well. And interestingly enough, when it comes to lobster, the main industry hasn't been as strong as it's traditionally been. But there's a significant portion of Maine lobster that gets flipped into the Maritimes to be processed and then resold into the United States.
Right.
So that's kind of a nuance there.
It's the car going back and forth again, right?
It is, right? And how's that going to be affected? So, yeah, I mean, it's not only crab. And we're always trying to diversify markets for other species. And, most of our members, we represent 15,000 workers in Newfoundland and Labrador, majority fish harvesters, processing plant workers as well. But most are multi-species enterprises. So it's not only snow crab that's going to be affected. Their bottom line on a lot of stuff is it's questionable how they're going to be impacted now.
Tom, you're going to say?
One of the things, though, Adam, is the issue of fairness. So when they talk about talk about Canada and Mexico having to have 25% tariffs, yet China is only at 10%, which to me is really surprising given how China especially subsidizes pretty huge industries for national competitive reasons.
And how he's talked about China, like historically too.
Indeed.
You're like,
And-
no, wait, what? Why is that lower?
And China's been very, very quiet in terms of his inauguration speech and other speeches. I mean, there is tariffs, to be fair, on Chinese vehicles, for example, which are 100%.
Yep.
But if in terms of putting a universal, it needs to be, if he's going to do 10% across the board for every country, okay, fine enough. I can understand that. But why are you picking on your biggest trading partners? And why does he keep on needling the Canadian government around being the 51st state and all those sort of things? I understand from a political standpoint why he may want to do that, speaking to his base. But once again, he's won the election. He has the highest approval ratings ever for him. This is a time to say, how do we consolidate? How do we make America great again by bringing in more jobs, making more money, making companies more competitive? So once again, sometimes I don't understand him, but that's, I guess, why he's a great disruptor.
Yeah, and the vehicle tariff, because that was under Biden to protect the EV industry, because in China, and there's the subsidy conversation there, but they're pumping out electric vehicles for cheap and selling them all around the world to shore that up. But now Trump's pulling out of Paris, and there's a lot of questions over the future of the EV industry as well, right? So,
and there's a lot of those manufacturing plants, mostly in Ontario, where workers are not working right now while those plants retool to prepare for the production of EVs. And so, what does that mean for employment insurance and how to benefit those workers who were anticipating manufacturing in electric vehicles here in Canada?
So in the meantime, right, this guy's in for 4 years, and we don't know what's going to come after that. Is it even possible? Here's a term: is it even possible to have any kind of a conscious uncoupling when it comes to some of the economy? Because I'm looking at, I think that's a Gwyneth Paltrow reference there, but I'm looking at Trudeau premiers urge shoppers to buy Canadian as country prepares for trade war. So this is the headline out of yesterday. First Minister's vowed to tackle long-standing internal trade barriers to boost the Canadian economy. What does that do for us, if anything? I'll look for the business prof.
Yeah. I think Jessica alluded to two things. I think, first of all, this is when we look at COVID, when we were trying to develop better supply chains around personal protective equipment, et cetera, that we could see that in the next 4 years in terms of having better supply chains, more local supply chains, and maybe even going back to traditional trading partners who we don't do as much work with anymore, like the United Kingdom and France and other areas. So we could see that potentially developing. And I think secondly, in terms of, but how do you pivot? Like as Dwan said, like if you're selling crab into the United States, you can't just suddenly say, oh, we're now going to sell crab into some other place.
Yeah, Europeans eat crab, but 90% is going to the States. That kind of a pivot is not happening, right?
And moreover, as Anne-Marie said, those it's business is a lot of times about relationships.
Yeah.
It's about who you know. It's about people you've been doing work with, the people you trust. And if you have, it takes a long while. It takes sometimes more than 4 years. Sometimes it takes decades to develop those types of relationships. But, business has a bottom line and labor has a bottom line as well. And if one of your suppliers is getting a call and saying, okay, well, you got to find 25% savings because we're not going to take this. What do you do? And that was similar when oil and gas in 2014, I believe, when that went quite down. A lot of the local Newfoundland and Labrador supply companies had to take those big pay cuts, and I remember big cost cuts. I remember speaking to them. It was super, super difficult, and it caused a lot of stress, caused a lot of unemployment, and all kinds of issues.
Emery, any thoughts?
Yeah, I guess just these aren't easy decisions.
No.
And you don't just pivot. You don't find a replacement for a 90% trading partner or 40% trading partner. You don't easily move operations elsewhere. You don't replace, these are really tough investment decisions. Also, you stop growing. And I think that's one of the things that we need to talk about too. Like businesses, early research indicates, the number one thing on the chopping block is growth and development plans. Of course, when times are uncertain, you just, you kind of huddle inside and you say, what can we do? What can we control? And in an environment when it feels like you're controlling very little, you get really risk adverse, you become really conservative, all things that do not grow the economy and create a strong environment for which to do business or to create for investment. So there's a lot of concerns, I think, that come from, and hearing Tom kind of go through the list of things that businesses are certainly assessing. None of those happen overnight.
We're at a time now where we're waiting for, for Newfoundland and Labrador, 3 elections, right? Local, municipal, provincial, and there's that big federal election, all happening this year. I'm thinking federally, but it could be any level. What are your thoughts around where we are with federal leadership and the timing of when the next election could be in May, might not be till the fall? All depends on a bunch of stuff. What kind of a position does that put us in?
I mean, it's not ideal the
No,
place
yeah.
that we're at with federal leadership. I mean, personally have concerns with a federal government here in Canada that may be too closely aligned with a Trump presidency and what that could mean for Canadians and for Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, which is why I think we need to be doing as much as we can right now to put the measures in place that will protect workers and businesses and industry in Canada, regardless of when the federal election happens. But I think that there's, a level of risk with throwing a federal election into the mix here. I think we do need some stability and leadership from the federal government, whether that's under Justin Trudeau or another leader.
Anyone else on that?
I agree.
Thank you for that. For a look ahead, I do have one other clip here to play from my conversation yesterday with economist Jim Stanford. So, Pike, give that a roll.
Thinking again, we've got threats for tariffs February 1st at this point. Where do you see this going? Where do you think this is going to land, and what will it mean for the Canadian economy?
Well, we're all scratching our head as to what Mr. Trump's intentions are. No one has a microscope, unfortunately, to actually see into his brain. He's back and forth so much on this. Clearly, he likes keeping his opponents off balance, and the threats and the bluster and the to and fro is part of that. The optimistic case is he's just trying to, create bargaining leverage to extract some concessions from other countries. Remember, Canada's not the only country in the crosshairs here. He's threatening Mexico, Europe, China, etc. And, what does he want from us? He wants something on the border. He wants more defense spending. He wants us to cut some of our taxes on the big U.S. tech companies, etc. That's the optimistic scenario. The pessimistic scenario is he actually, has an ambition to expand the United States. And he said that again in his inaugural remarks and use economic force to do it. I hope it's the former, not the latter, but even the former isn't very encouraging, Adam. The fact that he's willing to use economic force to basically compel other smaller countries to do his bidding is, first of all, a giant threat to our sovereignty. And secondly, if it works, then he's going to do it again, and in that regard, the message it sends to international companies is, if you want to protect yourself against these kind of threats, go to America. And that is a very dangerous message. The long-run impacts of this, even if he doesn't go ahead with the tariffs, are going to be very worrisome for Canada.
Jim Stanford, I appreciate your time and your expertise on this. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Adam. Thank you.
So that was us talking yesterday. So for folks in studio, any thoughts on the second Jim Stanford clip and just his look ahead there?
Yeah, I just one of the things that kind of comes to mind is the concern around, corporate concentration and foreign takeover of Canadian firms. What this, how this could impact, smaller Canadian firms and the influence of American businesses. I know corporate concentration is a major problem in the fishery, but I think in terms of protecting industry and protecting jobs in Canada, that's something to be thinking about, and also that this isn't going to be over in 4 years. I don't think we should assume that, when a new president is elected in 4 years' time, that means, if these tariffs are implemented, that they'd be lifted. So we need to think really long term. And then the final point that I'd make on what Jim Stanford had been saying there, Adam, is just what this will mean for the CUSMA negotiations. And this is obviously, what Trump is kind of getting at is renegotiating that Canada, U.S., Mexico trade agreement. And so how can we be more aligned with our allies like Mexico as we go into those negotiations? And is that a better place for us to be as Canada is trying to rally with other like-minded countries to respond?
Anyone else?
No, I think it just underscores the point around being really proactive
Yeah.
and strategic and thinking, as Jessica said, long term. This isn't necessarily something that we need to be ready for right now and can count on being over when President Trump's term is over.
Could be President Vance after Trump, right? And it could be a continuation or someone we don't even know about yet.
Yeah. So I think it is really important that we, step back and look long term and think proactive about how do we probably create a defense against this and ready ourselves so that maybe we're not as vulnerable to such decisions in the future.
Tom?
One of the things that worries me is the U.S. dollar. The U.S. dollar now is at trading with Canadian dollar at 69 cents. The Canadian dollar could go down even more because of this. And we still buy a lot of things coming into Canada regardless. And so do you start to question, do I get that orange or do I get some blueberries from Chile? Or do I take that trip to Florida, which I've always taken because I enjoy it and I like to see my friends or I like the beach or whatever, or do I decide to go to Portugal? There's going to be those kind of changes from there as well. But the other big thing, and we haven't really alluded to this very much, is those digital oligarchs, that the Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, all that sort of thing, and the influence they could have on Trump in terms of how we get our news, how we get our information, how we get a lot of things. And because those are very lightly regulated at that point. And we've seen the same thing with digital currencies, cryptocurrency, just, the last couple of days.
Oh, gosh, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, all those sort of things, they start to really worry me. And this is where Trump is. He's his own man, but he has some big people writing checks behind him. And that's one of the things that worry me. And that's not just for Newfoundland and Labrador, that's for the world. And, democracy is not perfect. It can be really difficult at times, but it's the best system we have right now. And and good democracy makes good business, makes good labor. And that's one of the things that worries me.
Duane, any thoughts from you?
No, I agree with all my colleagues. And, as Jessica alluded to, corporate concentration in the fishery, we've worked very, very hard to keep foreign entities out of our industry. We've seen what's happened in BC, a lot of foreign investment, and what that's meant for harvesters and processing plant workers on the West Coast. It's just been absolutely devastating. And we've had our own struggles here. We do have one foreign company, that's Royal Greenland, who's bankrolled by it's a crown corporation of the government of Denmark. And with the news this last week, I'm sure you've seen, they're starting to create a little bit of chaos, leaving their own association. So there's some internal turmoil there. And they've just been operating outside of our collective agreements, refusing to abide by those agreements. And there just doesn't seem to be any way to hold them accountable. So, what do we do if foreign influence starts growing? We are working very closely with other fisheries organizations in the Maritimes through the Canadian Independent Fish Harvesters Federation because they're having a lot of issues with foreign investment in their processing sector. So it's on our doorstep. And what a Trump presidency is going to mean when it comes to foreign investment in the fishing industry in Newfoundland and Labrador, we had to be very vigilant. And I think our provincial government have been doing a great job trying to hold Royal Greenland's feet to the fire. But, if foreign investment in our fishery starts taking off, then we're definitely in deep, deep trouble.
Looking at some headlines. So when I was getting ready for the show today, I was kind of going through CBC Politics page and just seeing what was there. And looking at the headlines for today, let me see. Canada bracing for possible influx of asylum claimants after Trump immigration orders. Provinces warn Ottawa slashing immigration program in half will hurt economy. Right? Government having provincial nominee programs as part of overall immigration cuts. We did that show yesterday. As Trump moves to withdraw from global commitments, China is waiting in the wings. Trump plans to pull U.S. out of World Health Organization, which we mentioned, and Paris Climate Agreement. So, looking ahead to the coming weeks, months, and years for Newfoundland and Labrador and the economy with, just those headlines at all, and Jessica, you mentioned before, this reminds you of just the approach to COVID, because it does, like a lot of that builds up to like crisis point stuff, does it not?
Yeah, I mean, this is an existential threat to our economy in Newfoundland and Labrador and in Canada. So we need to respond in a way that meets the moment through, our procurement policies, through our investment strategies, through bolstering domestic manufacturing and production, and how can we support industries? To Anne Marie's point earlier, how can we support firms through wage subsidies to keep people employed while they figure out what that pivot looks like? How do we modernize our employment insurance system, a program that is incredibly important to our seasonal industries in Newfoundland and Labrador, something that workers have been calling for our federal government to do for quite some time. We have we don't have a whole lot of time right now, but we need to be thinking strategically and making some of those changes to protect us, not just in the face of tariffs, but all of this instability that's coming at us. And we're operating in a environment of misinformation, right? That Tom was speaking about. So, staying true to our democratic values and our principles as Canadians, I think, is really important there too. And there's a role to play in civil society, within unions and the business community, to get out and talk to our members and talk to the general public about what the truth is of what's happening geopolitically and how it will impact you, and try to get people more engaged and involved beyond just scrolling through Facebook and seeing what those headlines look like. I mean, there's a democratic deficit in many ways in Canada, just as there is in the U.S., and that's something we all need to kind of get engaged with, or we go down a very, I think, dangerous path that won't be good for working people or businesses or anybody in the province.
Yeah, and you're mentioning all of that and still looking at, Trump pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement. The last time you were on the show, It was, I think, for Climate Week, and we were talking about unionized jobs and workers and the future of green jobs in the transition. And now there's stuff going to happen. You'll probably be back on the show again in a few months or within the next year of being like, so what does this mean for the transition? Are we still there? Where are we? What does this mean for us? And try to plan for that, like those unknowns on top of everything else.
Yeah, I mean, we're at a really, I think, good point in Newfoundland and Labrador. I'm very optimistic about the projects that are on the horizon. I talked about industrial policy during that show, I think, Adam, and that's, applying that to this context that we're in right now is important too. But we also have, for example, a lot of construction trades workers who could be working right now, who are looking to these projects as an opportunity to get good employment in Newfoundland and Labrador.
CNA has a whole program for folks.
We're building our education system around it. Yeah, so we need to be able to take advantage of the opportunities and not let what's happening with these tariffs kind of detract us from the path that we're heading towards, which is, hopefully full employment, really good jobs in every corner of the province.
Emery, yourself?
Well, my first reaction when I hear you read off those headlines is we're 3.5 days in.
I know.
Like, what?
Right? Like, it just, and that's just, I stopped it. I could have gotten more headlines, but I stopped.
Right. So I think, the things that Jessica is saying right now is exactly where we need to be, in the sense of, I hope the urgency right now that we've created, and I guess that's why we keep likening this to the pandemic. Yeah. The pandemic was urgent, and it brought us together in a more collaborative, more uniformly focused manner than probably ever before, or at least that we've seen in our time. And there's a little bit of this right now that feels like that. As much as we don't want to remember that time, I think the shared focus right now and the shared kind of objective and end game for where we all see that we need to go, the list that Jessica was just riddling off in terms of polishing off decisions and policies that we haven't looked at in a very long time to figure out, in the context of 2025, the threat that is, staring us in the face. We need to be more creative and probably more brave than we have in a long time.
Yeah, when I was putting the show together, I was like, wait, the inauguration was just Monday.
Right.
It feels like it was a couple of weeks ago at this point. Dwan, final thoughts from you?
No, I agree. And, those 3.5 days seem like an eternity already. And
I've got crow's feet already from just 3.5 days ago.
Just driving in here today, listening to the news, I know Gemma Hickey is on their way to Seattle and already experiencing some difficulties at the airport. I mean,
I didn't see that yet. I knew they were going. But.
Yeah, what it's going to mean. I mean, I have friends in the United States, and we talk on a weekly basis, and to just hear the concern and the fear. I mean, it's I feel for them right now, and have lived it for 4 years, and to be facing down Trump 2.0. it's a difficult time for all of us, and to see equality and feminism and so much challenged right now. I know it's really disheartening, but we all just need to stay united. And like Anne-Marie said, we have to be ready to fight like we've never fought before, because so much is being threatened right now. And I think if one thing we've learned from COVID, it's we can be proactive now, and we understand how important it is to pull together and have a united front.
Tom, 15 seconds to you.
Classic change management is all about having a common vision. And having a common vision, having a comprehensive approach is what's going to make us successful. And if we don't have that, it's going to help us. It's going to make us fail. So hopefully we'll have that common vision.
Tom Cooper, Anne-Marie Boudreau, Dewan Street, Jessica McCormick, thank you so much for this. All right, folks, that is it for today's show. Tomorrow, we are going back in time to the time of Confederation. You'll hear about a project called Letters to Joey, a collection of letters and telegraphs to the former premier of the province, people's concerns, stories about their lives, their hopes, their dreams from the late 40s to the early 50s. Don't miss the show. And thank you for listening, folks, as always. Cheers.